Hello everyone, and welcome to Fara's Guide. Today we're going to talk about episode 7, the differences between random, ranked, and competitive gameplay. Now, I myself have played in all three aspects, play lots of random games. I've played every ranked season, getting ranked 1, usually with a very high win rate, and I also do a lot of competitive gameplay with the fleet Omni in the variety of tournaments, cups, leagues, things like that go on in the European scene. So, there are some small nuanced differences between how one would approach gameplay in a random, where you don't really have much coordination, in a ranked, where there's enhanced coordination, but it's still not quite there. Communication between voice communications aren't quite there, and you have to rely more on text. And then when you go into full-blown, proper fleet versus fleet clan war style battles in competitive gameplay. What are the differences? How do we change our ship setup? The main topics within this subset will be the ship setup differences, the commander differences, the expectations within the battle, what's expected of you, what you think you might do between the different types, the incredible jump in importance of communication, and then sort of coordinating with your team, that wouldn't normally be possible in a random, but might be more passable in a ranked or competitive. And then finally, the hard carry, kicking, dragging your ranked team to victory, kicking and screaming, what you can do to make a win. So let's go into the game briefly. This is my Shokaku. It is currently set up for competitive and ranked gameplay. I don't have 2 Shokaku captains, I just want to use 1. And what do I mean by that? Well, right now, the difference in the current meta is that for the most part, we use the 3rd fighter rather than the 2 torpedo bomber groups. The reason this makes a difference, at least in competitive gameplay, is that enemy teams are splitting into 1 or 2 groups, but they always have overlapping defensive fire. So defensive fire baiting doesn't work because when one defensive fire is used and you lose planes, a second defensive fire is always ready. When the first defensive fire ends, the second one can be used, and when the second one is finished, the first one can be used again. So this may be something like a defensive fire Benson with the Kutuzov. Usually competitive happens in the tier 8 bracket. It's very difficult to get a meaningful strike in with your bombers, and the aircraft carrier can have a 2-minute defensive fire as well. There's a lot of communication on the enemy team. They can all focus down your bombers, so there's less of an emphasis on the aircraft carrier getting attacks in, and a significantly higher emphasis on site control, site denial, and if the opportunity arises, then sure, you can do some bombing. So this is why we go with 3rd fighter. Now, this isn't to say this is the only setup. There are instances where you can use 2-2-2, but for the most part, we use 3 fighters. So that's one difference. The other difference is on the captain. This captain is heavy self-reliance anti-air, so that you are not a victim of carrier sniping. So we have the basic fire training, advanced fire training, manual fire control for AA armament. This means we're dropping torpedo armament expertise in random battles and possibly in ranked battles, but probably just random battles. Torpedo armament expertise is more favorable. The chances of us being struck are less. We want to bomb more with our 2 torpedo bomber squadrons. We want to have more of an influence in the game in terms of sinking ships. But in an organized, ranked, or competitive game, actually torpedo armament expertise isn't as necessary because we only have 1 torpedo squadron, and to be fair, basic fire training would give us a lot more benefit at defending ourselves, killing off planes that try and scout us. Just there's a whole multitude of things where the game changes and shifts from you bombing to you being scouting and site denial. So we don't need the torpedo bombers to load quicker because they kind of sit and loiter for sometimes up to the entire game, 10-15 minutes, waiting till end game when the enemy thins out and you have an opportunity to attack. So in that respect, basic fire training is more valuable. So that's a difference in ship setup. That's a difference in commander setup. Moving on, we have a quick, we can go into the WoW's Tactics training room, so I'll bring that up. In this particular instance, we're playing on the map Trident, and on our team, we have, let's say, 1 or 2 good AA destroyers, like an Akazuki, or perhaps we have a cruiser that has good anti-air, and in this instance, perhaps it's a Chapayev offering radar, or perhaps it's a Kutuzov. These ships are hidden because they're behind the islands, and they can typically only be spotted when the planes go into the AA bubble field. Enemy fighter is smart, he's not going to want to do that. But if you have a destroyer who's kind of in the open or, you know, behind an island, and Akizuki especially, it's very difficult to see him. Provided you spot the enemy fighters, so you show them, because it's the detection range, then the Aki can use his AA on the enemy fighters. So you can communicate with your team insofar as to say you can bait planes in, and you don't need to engage the planes, you just need to spot them, communicate to your team, hey, there's fighters over you, I want you to click them, and then you say, oh yeah, there they are, I'll click them, so he control left clicks, and you might kill 1 or 2 planes. And it's just that small edges throughout the game bleeding the enemy dry, because you'll find that most of your plane losses are not to the enemy carrier, but to the enemy ship's anti-air. You are using your fighters to jostle, to deny SOUT, to deny the enemy carrier from spotting your destroyer, or at the very least, preventing him from maybe getting a bomb hit in. You just creating a blanket wall, you cannot pass this area. But you yourself have to be careful of enemy anti-air as well. We talked about communication. Normally, the dive bombers in your team will be used as a scouting force. Dive bombers scout because they're the most sacrificial plane. The torpedo bomber allows you to get a little bit of damage in if it's necessary, or if the opportunity comes at the very end. The fighters are for sight denial and for team protection. The dive bombers you want to use to fly around and to spot the enemy as much as possible. And this is more competitive, but it can also have an impact in ranked as well. If you want to stretch an enemy player, as we've told about what you do with air supremacy on the enemy team, or air superiority, we can use our dive bombers to spread them out. In competitive game mode, you'll find that dive bombers are not used in the offensive fashion of doing damage, but more of a scouting role. Now, you don't need to drop the payload of the dive bomber immediately. You can attack a target, then you can keep it loitering around at maximum speed. Or, if it's really important that you see what the enemy's doing, where they're going, what their positioning is, so that your team can anticipate, are they going A, are they going B, and even this counts in ranked battle as well. You need to see where they're going as quickly as possible. So the first plane that you might take off is a dive bomber. Drop the payload and fly up as fast as possible to see what is the enemy team doing, and then we can maneuver the dive bomber. So we spot for torps, we spot for team composition, is there any stragglers, and the enemy fighter, he might spread out, he might go in different directions, but this is slight nuance differences between randoms and ranked and competitive. In random, you don't necessarily need to scout with the dive bombers first, because, you know, you don't need to know what the team's doing immediately. You can have your bombers together ready for an attack, whereas, and you can scout, you're given away, you can scout with the fighters a little bit more. The problem with scouting fighters in a ranked or competitive game is that very smart cruiser players will turn their AA off, because when your fighter starts taking AA damage, you'll get a sound notification, or if your dive bomber starts taking damage, you get a sound notification. So for example, this Kutuzov player, or maybe this Chapayev player, could be very smart. The red team's dive bomber is flying over the middle to see him, but the AA is turned off on our friendly green cruiser. The dive bomber flies over, and then the ship waits till he gets close, then he turns his A on, then he turns his defensive fire on perhaps, and then by the time you're like, oh, I'm spotted, oh, there's the ship, and I'm taking fire, and you're trying to fly away, that turnaround in flight time, the wave's already dead. And that's important. It's worth a defensive fire, because it's unlikely that this carrier is going to be attacked by torpedo bombers or another dive bomber. He'll be with another ship that can provide a secondary defensive fire. Plus, what's important is bleeding off the enemy's sight, keeping him blind, not knowing what's going on. So you have to be careful of AA traps, and this is where communication can be really important. Expectations of the battle? Well, you are a glorified scout machine in competitive. Sometimes you can get attacks in, sometimes not. In ranked is slightly different, because in ranked, to be effective, you can gamble by going with 3 fighters and in competitive and allowing your team to do the damage and you giving them sight. But when you're in ranked game modes, that is more tricky. Typically, I personally play a balanced setup. If the enemy carrier goes air superiority, as we've spoken about in episode 6.7, how to deal with air superiority. In that instance, we would use our dive bombers to scout and try and stretch the enemy fighters apart. But I still want my 2 torpedo bombers rather than just 1, so that I can have a meaningful impact in the battle and sink ships. Ranked isn't super coordinated, and you can have bad players on your team. You need to be prepared to carry your team to victory, and that's the hard carry. And I do have a clip about that when I played on the American servers against some OPG carriers, I believe, which we'll put in the video description for the example, and we'll link a clip in the World of Warships EU forum for the aircraft carrier guide section, where I have my main thread. So, with regards to expectations, in a ranked game, you're expected to scout. You're expected to prevent the enemy team from bombing. Very similar to, in random battles, you might be expected to bomb and to maybe do some fighter protection. But in ranked and competitive, because of the smaller team numbers, because you're playing for points, and what matters is not your experience. What matters is not how many plane kills you go, how much damage you do, it's the win. The only thing that matters is the win. This means that even losing just one ship can lose the whole game. It can be a super close game, but if you're not on your ball, or you don't have fire control, or you don't have protection over your ships, and you allow the enemy team to get a strike in, or maybe you can get a strike in with your torpedo bombers and you kill one ship, you now have the point advantage. If you have the point advantage and you both have equal capture points, the enemy team needs to play at a disadvantage to come at you to regain the advantage. They have to kill off a ship, or they have to grab a capture point, and this means they have to play risky. They have to come out of their comfort zone and play dangerously. And if they have to play dangerously, then that means you already have another advantage because you can shoot them from a more defensive position. So these are slight nuanced differences between random, ranked, and competitive. In the video demonstration I have in the description below, it is a game where I am playing... it's 2 heroes because it's tier 7 is the bracket. And it was all about... trying to protect their team with fighters, trying to scout, trying to anticipate where the enemy bombers are, trying to micro your fighters, communication with the team as well, trying to explain what you're going to do, where you're going to go, what are the capture points, what's the basic goal. If you're playing ranked battles, it's often useful to agree on an objective at the beginning and then to work with it. But the level of difficulty raises in competitive because you expect the enemy carrier to be better, and in that scenario there's a lot of communication that goes on the conversations. You need to talk with the team. What do they need scouting for? What do they need to see torps in advance? Is there any threat of the enemy team being bombing? You need to find out what the enemy carrier is, more so than on random or ranked. You need to know, well, what's his composition? Is he 3 fighters? Is he 2 fighters? Is he balanced? Is he strike? What can he do? Then you can work accordingly. I mean, if he is, if the enemy team is strike and or balance set up and your air superiority, then you need to use your fighters to muscle out his bombers and nullify him. You can't allow him to get that one good hit in, and the team needs to know that. So there's a lot of experience. There's a lot of communication that comes in there, and it goes up. The level of communication required jumps up remarkably to ranked, jumps up even higher when you go into competitive, especially since you can use voice comms. Chat commands and F commands are very useful for ranked. And for me personally, while sometimes I use air superiority, it depends on the meta and the tier of ranked. But I do feel that having the ability to bomb, to strike with multiple torpedo bombers with the Japanese carriers, because unfortunately the Americans are not viable as of version 6.4, is more valuable, and that's where I get my win rate. In the games where I can bomb, I have more of an influence on the battle. On the games where I cannot bomb and I'm fighter heavy, I'm reliant on my team to win the battle. That's fine and competitive because I can influence with scouting and communication, but in ranked and randoms, you're more reliant on random people that you have no communication with, you don't know, you're just playing with randomly, that matchmaking has thrown you together, so you need to be able to be reliant and do something about the game yourself. And that's what we've got in the video description down below with our game against an OPG carrier. I think it's A4 or something. So I hope you enjoyed that clip. And actually, now that I think about it, that's the end of all the topics. So, for the most part, this is the end of Fara's aircraft carrier guide. The main thread is on the World of Warships EU forum. In the ship section under aircraft carriers with the guide, we have a listing of all the topics that were covered, including example clips and main classroom lectures, similar to this one today. This is more of a classroom lecture with the WoW's tactic room. There's a number of examples and clips. Some are 2 minutes, some are 20 minutes long, showcasing what I've been describing in the kind of theory of the WoW's tactic room actually being applied in practice. Additional material may be added at time. If you have any questions or you want to know something, or you feel I haven't covered a particular topic, or perhaps you wish to challenge me, you feel, no, I think you got that wrong, or I think you should do it this way, you're more than welcome to either post comments and reply down below in the YouTube, or post them in the forums as well, or post it in Reddit and call me out. That's always welcome. This tutorial guide has been, from my point of view, my experiences as playing on the American and European server clusters over the last couple of thousand games. What I do may not be suitable for your playstyle, but it is how I go about it, and I didn't feel necessarily there was a guide out there that covered in depth and detail how I want to play carrier, you know, or how I would go about it. And if you don't make a guide, you don't get the ability to criticize. So this is why I've made this guide, to try and help people learn the basics of carriers, more medium and intermediate stuff, the advanced elements of carriers, the differences between types of carrier games, you know. So hopefully you've learned something and you've had fun with me along the way. Thank you very much for watching. Until next time, whenever I make another video, you're welcome to come along, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and we'll see you then. Goodbye, guys.